Welcome to a new year. A year which will bring joys and sorrows, problems and solutions, challenges and rest. Today, we're going to be talking about rest. What does the Bible say about it? Why do we need it, and what happens if we fail to do it? And once we understand why it matters, how do we actually do it? Rest gets mentioned in various places and contexts through the Bible, starting with God resting on the seventh day after creation, and moving through various psalms, Sabbaths and festivals to Jesus taking a time out to rest. I'm only going to be looking at two specific examples today, but there is a lot more that you can read around if you want to dig deeper. The first that I'm going to look at is Exodus 20, 8 to 11, which is the fourth of the Ten Commandments, and says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." As part of the Ten Commandments, this is actually putting the importance of rest up there with not serving other gods and not murdering people. I feel like this indicates it's probably pretty important. Rest is included in the core rules which were given to God's chosen people. And it was written in such a way that it clarified everyone needs to rest. Unlike most of the other commandments, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, this one goes for some repetitive clarification. You shall not work on the Sabbath, your children shall not work on the Sabbath, your servants or slaves shall not work on the Sabbath, your animals shall not work on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for rest. Rest is sufficiently important that 1 day in 7 should be set aside for it, for everyone. The other passage I'm pulling out today is Exodus 23, 10 to 13, which says, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the sons of your servant woman," which in other translation is slaves born in your household, and the alien, which in other translations would be foreigners, may be refreshed. Not only are we supposed to have rest on a regular basis as human beings, along with the animals that we have roped into helping with our plans, but even the land is supposed to have regular periods of rest. Rest is an intended part of creation right down to its core. Now, this is the time of year when a whole lot of people make statements about improvements they want to make in their lives, most of which will be ignored or forgotten about within a few months. Personally, I don't do New Year's resolutions. If I think a change is important, I would rather start when I decide it than set a future date for beginning. But for some people, it's a helpful and important starting point. So for anyone who does New Year's resolutions, I'm going to ask, did you have rest more or rest better on your list? Feel free to stick your hand up if you did, but I'm not seeing a lot of hands, nor was I expecting to. Now, keep that in mind for a bit later. So why do we need to rest? Other than the biblical thing we've just said, that it's an integral part of creation that is commanded, rest allows us recovery from physical and mental exertion. There are various compounds and hormones which build up in our bodies through exertion and stress, which affect our performance. Rest allows your body to filter these out and deal with them. Rest leaves you refreshed and ready to perform well again. If we want to be able to function well in our daily lives and in helping others, we need to take time to rest to enable that to happen. To truly understand why we need rest, it's more effective to talk about what happens if we don't rest enough rather than to just try and look at the science of what rest actually does. The most obvious effect of not resting, in particular of not getting enough sleep, is that you feel tired. We all know how that works. While you can push through feeling tired for a while, and it can be right to do that for a period in some circumstances, it feels harder to do things when you are tired, and if you let it go too far, it can impair your judgment in the same way alcohol can impair your judgment. How long you can go without adequate rest and how long recovery takes, how severe the consequences are, varies from person to person, as well as changing as you age or develop medical conditions. At this point, I would expect most people around have heard of burnout. It's something that's got much more attention in recent years, even if you don't have a good understanding of what it is. In short, burnout is what happens when people are overworked and have inadequate rest for long enough that it has effects on their physical and mental health. Depending how long a person has been experiencing burnout before taking action to fix it, and how effective the actions they take are, it can take anywhere from weeks to years to recover. On a small scale, I would hazard a guess most adults here, and especially people like teachers who have periods, set periods when there's a lot of work and then set holidays, most of us would have had the experience of pushing through a busy period, finally getting to your time off, and then promptly getting sick and spending 3 to 4 days of your break recovering from a cold or whatever it is that you got. If you don't rest by choice, you get run down. And once you get too run down, your body is going to make you rest one way or another. Burnout leaves you feeling like you're running on empty and have nothing left to give to anything. Too tired to do the things you enjoy, irritable and anxious. It can lead to increased blood pressure, unhealthy changes in eating habits, hormonal imbalances, and depression. That's only looking at it from the perspective of effects on individuals who are overworked as well, not factoring in the extended effects on family, friends, and society in general. Now, I ended up in a situation where my work changed towards the end of 2003, where I would have ended up in the early stages of burnout. One role was cut due to the economic situation, and the alternative role was both significantly different to my existing skill set and involved time shifts that were not conducive to functional sleep patterns. While those issues were acknowledged and there was intent to modify what the role might look like, there were not resources available to make that happen in a viable timeframe. Fortunately, in my case, unlike most people working in that industry, I had previously studied ministry. And ministry is an area that has very high levels of burnout, which means that when I was studying it, there was an emphasis on making sure people knew what burnout was and how to recognise it before it became serious. Now that meant I was able to pick what was going on and flag it and do something about it before it could have created long-term problems. Now, as it turns out, in Australia, despite our love of public holidays and our 4 weeks of dedicated annual leave every year, Australia's work-life balance is actually pretty bad compared to other OECD nations. OECD research put Australia 34th out of 41 member countries, with 12.5 Australians working more than 50 hours a week. 12.5% of Australians working more than 50 hours a week, compared to 0.3% of people in the Netherlands, 3.3% in Canada, 10.4% in the US, who we routinely mock for having a toxic work culture, and 10.8% in the UK. Only 2 similar OECD nations had worse figures, New Zealand at 14%, and Japan, which is widely known for having an unhealthy work culture and excessive expectations, at 15.7%. A 2023 report, shortchanged by the Australia Institute, found that on average, full-time Australian workers are doing over 6 hours of unpaid overtime each week. These are not evenly spread, as around a third of Australian workers want more work, while 11% want less. Considering the impacts, both physical and mental health, which overwork causes, this is a problem. And while the statistics I have here are based on paid employment, overwork and burnout aren't exclusively related to paid employment. Anyone who is not getting sufficient rest can encounter them. People in unpaid roles volunteering, homemaking, or acting as carers experience this, as do people who spend extended periods on low incomes, and especially if that income is uncertain or involves dealing with certain government agencies who are not conducive to good mental health. The reason the statistics I have are related to paid employment is that it's a lot easier to find employment-related statistics because more money is available for studying things that affect productivity and profit. So burnout is pretty serious business, but it's also a word that is only applied to people who are alive. In English, we don't have a specific word for death by overwork, but in Japan, whose work culture is surprisingly not that much more toxic than ours, they do. That word is karoshi. Commonly, it's a stroke or a heart attack, but it can also include suicides caused by overwork and excessive work-related stress. A World Health Organization study puts global deaths from karoshi at around 750,000 people per year. Now, at this point, I feel like I should ask, does anyone want to change their answer to the question about New Year's resolutions? I certainly decided I needed to take rest a bit more seriously while I was writing this. So if we know that rest is biblically based and is supported by research as being important for health, how do we make sure that we rest adequately? One of the first steps is realising that things that look like rest and things that are actually restful are not necessarily the same. It varies from person to person and what you need rest from. Some people actually find cooking and cleaning restful. Weird, I know, but some of them do, while others couldn't think of anything worse. Some, like me, go camping or bushwalking, while others hate the entire concept of that. On the flip side, some things which look like rest from the outside might not always be restful. Sitting down and watching TV, doom scrolling on social media, or playing games often doesn't actually leave you feeling rested. While you might be resting physically, those things might not let you rest mentally. And for a lot of us, that is where we actually need to make space to rest. Resting adequately requires you working out what will leave you feeling rested and actually doing that. If you do things that involve a lot of physical activity on a regular basis, then the most important rest for you might be chilling on the couch watching TV or reading. If what you do uses a lot of mental energy but is less physically demanding, then probably the most important rest for you will be something that rests your mind. And that might be something which involves physical movement, such as walking, so that your focus is in the here and now, rather than potentially drifting to mull over problems. The second step is recognising quality rest as a priority. There are a lot of demands on our time, and it is easy to put rest aside as it doesn't immediately seem to be productive. And there is always something more important that needs doing. I, like many people, am bad at this. Even though I know it's important, I still end up checking off tasks and then scrolling Facebook, rather than scheduling the camping trip that would actually refresh me and leaving a few tasks to do later. Eventually I do the trip and think I should have done this 2 months ago. I need to schedule these more regularly, and then I do not schedule them. Now, I mentioned recognising burnout and taking action with my previous job, and the first action to take was to work out where I could work some scheduling magic to get a camping trip in for a real break. That trip probably bought 3 to 4 weeks of additional function in that role while looking at potential modifications, and avoided a leadership change in the middle of the busiest time of year for that business. That's actually pretty productive for a couple of days off, especially given we broke sales records 3 times in that following period. And that time off would have had a better effect if it hadn't been left so long, if I'd recognised it earlier and done things more regularly. The longer you push through things without adequate rest, the longer it takes to recover. That means long-term failing to prioritise rest will decrease your productivity in whatever way you want to measure that, whether that's in terms of work or in terms of study or in terms of assisting others. The third step is actually defending your rest. Sometimes you will need to say no to people. You will need to be unavailable short-term in order to be available to do good in the long term. Some people really struggle with this. A person asks for help and they feel obliged to do it every time. Helping people is great. Definitely don't take away from this that I said you shouldn't help people. If that's your takeaway, go on YouTube later and watch the sermon again. But if you give up rest to help people every time, you will get to a point where you can't help them, whether or not you want to. To decide when you give up rest to help someone, you need to think about what they need, how time sensitive it is, where you're at with your need for rest, and whether there are other people who they could ask. Sometimes you also need to acknowledge that someone else's rest is important, and you can either wait for something, find your own solution, or step in to help a third party. But when you're working out whether someone really needs your help in a time of rest, you're going to look at what they're doing. If they need something that you actually enjoy doing, you will probably have said yes before you even remember this, and that's good, because if it's something you enjoy doing, it's probably not having a negative effect on your rest. If it's not something you enjoy, and it's not time sensitive, and there are other people that person could ask, and you have been asked at a time when you were intending to be resting, then you should probably consider no. And if it's something that is important and time sensitive, you might need to respond without assessing the other questions and rearrange when you're doing your rest. Part of what I like about camping trips is it solves the people asking for help issue to a large extent, due to the simple fact of being somewhere else. In my previous role, I was one of the people who would get asked about weird problems at weird times because I was one of the people who could solve them. So when I was going on a trip, I'd put a message in the relevant work chats along the lines of, I'm going away on these days. If you're going to have a catastrophe which needs my attention, have it before Thursday or after Monday. If you think you need me between Thursday or Monday, just don't. Now that doesn't mean nothing comes up, obviously, The world doesn't work like that. But it stops the minor things coming through and it lets people know that I might not respond. Now, I've still talked people through solving an issue if a message came through that I could solve easily remotely, or told them who else to ask. Now, on the trip where I had burnout, I also ended up saving a copperhead which had its head stuck in a discarded can. While rescuing a venomous snake without tools available is not exactly restful at the time, there is a satisfaction in knowing an animal that would have died due to someone else's carelessness is now out there living its best life because of you. That can contribute well to your rest later. Now, this is very late in a sermon to be adding a disclaimer, but I have done snake handling and management training with reptile rescue. Please don't just go and handle venomous snakes if you don't have the relevant knowledge and skills. All 3 species of snake in Tasmania are venomous and potentially fatal. They also all use the same antivenom, so if someone gets bitten around you, please don't try to catch or kill the snake for identification purposes. The hospital doesn't want it, and most snake bites actually come from mishandling snakes or trying to kill them, so you're probably just increasing the pressure on an already strained health system anyway. Now, I'm going to invite the band to come back up while I wrap up. The Bible tells us that rest is important by commanding it very clearly and by illustrating it as an intended and integral part of creation. The reason that we need it is simply we can't function properly without it, with consequences of failing to rest ranging from mild discomfort through to death, depending exactly how stupid and stubborn we try to be about it. How we go about resting is that we work out what forms of rest we need as individuals, we prioritise it as being important, and we defend it both for ourselves and for others. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata.